So thank you for having me. It's really exciting to be back at Pause in a new venue, talking about new odysseys and stuff. It's a very great provocation for this scary new decade, and a bit of a chance to recap on the last one as well. So I guess that's where we'll kick off. I mean, the world is changing. The once absurd is now a reality. At Vice, we used to pair unlikely individuals like Dennis Rodman and Kim Jong-un together for like entertainment or shock value. Now we don't need to do that anymore because we've got the other Kim and Trump hanging out in the White House. So they've got to sort of lift the bar for entertainment a little bit. The impossible is now possible. You know, we're making huge strides scientifically and in the field of technology. We're rethinking old systems. And we're witnessing some truly amazing evolutions. And this is something that I'll speak to a little bit more later in how much that's inspiring this next generation of young people in how they see the 2020s and beyond. We're seeing brands take on a role in society like never before. You know, it's like one for the Pause Fest bingo card, I suppose, of purpose and values. But, you know, we're even seeing this play out in different ways. So porn sites shutting down to get people attending the protests in Hong Kong. So thinking a bit outside the box, having a role to play in, you know, what they believe and what kind of world they want to build. We've seen a political and economic shift from the west to the east in the last, 10, 20 years, and this is something that's going to continue as well. APAC's the epicenter of youth culture. 60% of the world's young people live here. To put that in perspective, 1 million people in India turn 18 every month, which is pretty nuts. And in the next 10 years, not only will these guys enter their peak earning and spending years, but they're also going to be the ones who are defining and shaping culture, creativity, innovation as we look forward into the next decade. So a little bit about why I'm up here. I work at Vice, so we started as a street magazine in Montreal in 1994. So if you're a millennial or a Gen Y or a Gen X, you've probably stolen the magazine from a public toilet somewhere at some point in the last 20 years. And now we're this. So we are a global multi-platform, multi-channel youth publisher with lines of business spanning digital publishing, TV channels, Virtue, our creative studio, Vice Studios, where we make TV shows and movies, and a newsroom as well. We're on every platform known to man, so about 40 million cross-platform followers in Asia, 6.5 in Australia. I think that's all the numbers that I needed to just smish into there. And what we do is that we speak to young people about what's going on in their worlds. We try and understand them, we make content for them, and when we work with brands, we try and help them, make an inroad into that world in a way that actually matters. But we don't only use our content to do that, we also do research. So that's my job. I'm the head of insights for APAC, and I, look after our little nest of data that we've got. I run our youth research. I talk to people, culture makers, and people in our network about what's going on in different categories, and we really try and understand our place in the world and what's going on in the world of people in the millennial, Gen Z brackets. So I guess for today, I wanted to sort of just recap a bit about what we saw in the last decade that's going to define the next one, particularly for the Gen Zs, the next generation coming through. We're passing this torch down to these guys now. And I wanted to just ask which of these shifts are really going to define what things look like in the 2020s. And this is, as creatives, as marketers, this is really important when trying to connect with this next, generation of audiences coming through. And a few of the things I'll talk about today are fluidity. That's one for the bingo card as well. That will be mentioned at some point. Truth, making content in a post-truth world. And optimism. We've heard a lot about mental health and the effects, that have had on people in the last decade, but I wanted to sort of talk to you about a little bit about what the 2020s are going to look like through a bit of a new lens. So let's jump into it. We often talk about millennials and Gen Zs or Gen Z and Y, whatever you want to call them, as this big homogenized blob of 2.5 billion people. But there are some really key differences in how these generations define themselves, which means some huge changes in how we market to them and make content for them, which are really important to remember as we go into a new decade and this younger group starts coming through. So Gen Z are the first truly borderless generation. They're the most globalized, digitized, worldly, and aware generation in history, way more so than any before them. And to really pause and think about what that means, for people who are, say, in my age bracket, slightly older, imagine if you were just born completely online. You don't know a world without the internet. You have everything at your fingertips. You're exposed to influences from all over the world 24/7. Your neighborhood was a social platform. You don't go outside to hang out with your friends. You go inside Fortnite to hang out with your friends, and the game is sort of secondary to that. You never have to sneak out, you sneak into your mobile phone. It gives you this agency and autonomy that teenagers have never had before. And you have a ticket to any cultural moment in your pocket. You know, you can like be chatting with a celebrity in their DMs that, you know, is like your biggest hero, plus you can be connecting with a community of people just like you from some, you know, subculture that exists all around the world, whilst attending a concert online. Like, it's just, you know, all of this would mean that you don't see the same borders that everybody else sees. So to really break that down, the generational difference that we see between millennials and Gen Z, which is what we try to remember when we're making content, is that millennials were born pre-internet, you know, we're pretty archaic. Like, we had this really small sphere of influence, very, you know, bordered, you know, we had CDs, DVDs, and magazines influencing our identity. We spent our weekends at Westfield, you know, walking around on our feet. We had sleepovers and three-way phone calls. We paid for things with cash, and we were really, really analog. So narrow sphere of influence means that we kind of have this fairly small, you know, amount of stuff informing who we are and what we like, you know, in those formative years. Whereas Gen Z, online since birth, you know, programmed recommendations and influencers, like I said, coming at them 24/7 across multiple platforms, all filtered through an algorithm, you know, so that's what sort of a worry in itself. Completely decoupled from physical things like cash. Their lives are really digital, and they see the world for this reason through a prism of influences and experiences. So when we're making content for these guys, we sort of think about millennials as operating in lanes of identity and Gen Z as operating in layers. So millennials will sort of go, here's who I am, I like this genre of music, I work here, this is, you know, these are my, you know, parts of myself, and they're all kind of a bit separate, they intermingle a bit, but, you know, that's kind of where we're at. And that's how most millennials will choose to define themselves when we ask them that question. Whereas with Gen Z, it's more about layers. It's like, well, I'm this, and I'm also an artist, and this influences that, and there's kind of, you know, a lot more stuff coming in. There's a lot more light and shade, there's a lot more overlaps, and there's a lot more intersections to play with, which makes for a really, really interesting audience. New York Times wrote about this late last year, where they were talking about, I guess, the multiple personalities being a really, really strong trait of Gen Z, you know. All of these opportunities that get brought about when we operate in layers and we have multiple things going on, multiple things influencing us, create some serious opportunities compared to the generations before them. And so when we're making content for ourselves and for the brands that we work with, you know, the number one thing that we try to do is spot interesting overlaps between different personas, different mindsets, different influences, and we try and play in those overlaps. So I'm going to show you an example of some content that we made with Carlings, which is a clothing store in Europe. This is from Virtue, our creative agency. And we wanted to sort of explore the intersection of, you know, the passion that young people have for looking good online, being able to represent themselves in any way they like on social media, but also deeply caring about, you know, the waste issue behind the fashion industry. What is the clothes that I'm buying doing to this planet? You know, it's a real great area that we wanted to explore, and this is what we came out with.
Our generation lives in a paradox. On one hand, we love to express our style and creativity online. On the other, we want to reduce all the production waste that has a negative impact on the environment. A paradox caused by the unwritten rule that we can't be seen online in the same outfit twice. So how do we secure a better future while maintaining our creative output online? With a digital clothing collection, a series of virtually fitted fashion items that you only wear in digital space. This is how it works. First, you take a picture. You choose a product from the web shop before a 3D tailor adjusts the product to your image. Now, your outfit is ready to be shared on social media. This is a new way of expressing our fashion creativity without leaving a negative footprint on the world.
And it sounds pretty batshit that this works, right? But this has actually become a product offering that they have now, digital clothing collections, which can be paid for at a much lower price point, that have been rolled out into other collections. So it's just an example of how we're sort of trying to address problems using what we know about the next generation coming through. So that's a little bit about who they are, and how we make content for them is changing too. So here's a little bit about how we do that, I guess, in a post-truth world that's very polarized and you know, cluttered in the digital space with you know, a lot of publishers like us competing for news, competing for views. So the major shift that happened in the 2010s is that truth is discovered, no longer delivered. So young people have grown up in a world where they know that they can't just trust that the first thing they read is going to be correct. There's been a real culture of information gathering come through as a result of that, and nothing can be taken at face value. So reading different sources, checking points of view, realising that they do live in an echo chamber. These have been some huge learnings that happened in the 2010s that have affected how they consume content. It could explain why Gen Zs are so privacy conscious. So nearly all of them, or over half, say that one of their number one personality traits is that they like to be well informed. Their number one attitudinal shift that we've seen come through in recent years is that they are privacy conscious and that they're concerned about the internet eroding their privacy, what's happening with their data, and being more aware of those types of issues. There's a few reasons for this. So number one is that they feel a bit shortchanged by what they're learning in school. It's not really keeping up with the 21st century and teaching us how to, to check this stuff, to cross-reference, to exist in a technological world. Technology, creativity, critical thinking are three of the top skills that they feel is missing from their education. And the second is that, as much as we know that getting all of our news from social media is really, really bad, raise your hand if you still do it, that's me. That's kind of the world that we live in. We're not totally in control of the information that we see, and we've seen the impacts of that via, Trump, Brexit, even our own election last year as a bit of an interesting talking point there. So for this reason, and this was something that we sort of put together in our year-end review, our audience looks to sources to inform them but allow them to form their own opinion as well. And part of this discovery process is gathering information from various sides and various sources, so being really proactive with that stuff. So with this in mind, how do we approach making content? The first principle that we have, 4 principles really when we go out and we're making content, and this is what we apply worldwide, is find the humanity. So let people explain their side of the story and try and get below what the first perception might be. This example is Vicky, who is a woman from Rockbank in Victoria who has about 10 crocodiles living in her house, and on face value she may seem like a bit of a kook, but she was actually one of the most genuine, understanding, empathetic, incredible people with the most incredible story of how she got to be in this position. And so letting her lead with her story and showing the humanity in that, potentially memeable kind of situation is one of the things that we try to do there. The second is experiment voraciously. So we know that most of our young audience, particularly Gen Zs, are completely platform agnostic. They're not, choosing Facebook over Instagram, over Snapchat and spending a lot of time there. They're kind of on all of them all the time, and you have to have a platform strategy for that. Example here is us making a podcast but delivering it out through all of our social platforms through a style that was adapted and native to those platforms, which worked really well. The third is to bring a point of view, not an agenda. So I guess in a world that is so polarised, being able to let people tell their own stories, bringing in people from all sides of the political, the social spectrum, and sort of getting a bit under the lid of what's going on in their worlds and what issues matter to them is the way that we try to approach that. That's a still from Vice Votes when there was several elections going on in Asia last year. And again, we brought in people from all across the spectrum to really just be earnestly talking about the stuff that matters to them. And the fourth, and probably the most important one, is to take the audience with you. Show, don't tell, and to, again, let people at the centre of these stories tell them for themselves. And that's something that we've realised we can really offer in this new space of polarity and of clutter in the digital world. So with all of these 4 principles in mind, there's a clip that I want to show you that's not actually been released yet. It's coming out next week. It's about a minute from our upcoming documentary Into the Bushfires. And while there was barely a moment where you didn't see that in your newsfeed, while we were in the height of that, there was a lot of polarity. There was a lot of arguing and infighting. And what we wanted to do is kind of get to the centre of that, to see some of the towns and to talk to some of the people who were still dealing with the aftermath, and just let that human story come through. So I'm just going to play you a little clip from that now.
Where to from here?
I'm going to have to deal with my own shock. I'm going to have to deal with our community shock. I'd like to sort of be involved in somehow healing the land. Yeah, sorry, this is that one. The forest is destroyed. It's just not there. This forest is, it's alive. But still, life pops out. Life can pop out of amazing things. I saw the ants are still doing it. The first bird I heard was a lyrebird. So hey, that's pretty amazing. Yeah. So we live in interesting times, as the Chinese curse goes. Yeah.
You seem very grounded and optimistic about everything.
Optimistic, yeah, well, hey, breathing out. Tobacco, but well, there's been so much support and care. It's astounding.
Cool. So keep your eye out for that one. It's coming out next week, I believe. And there's some really, really incredible stories in there that we were really privileged to be able to tell. And off the back of that last clip, I wanted to, take the opportunity to talk about that sense of optimism that was mentioned. So not obviously in the starry-eyed, everything's going to be fine sense, as I said, we're at the start of a pretty complex decade. But I guess more in the sense of like the resilience that we're starting to see, and the aptitude and the people feeling like they can take this on, as we move into a new decade. And that's something that we particularly see from Gen Z. So these days there is a lot of talk about the end of the world, particularly on Vice.com, I'm the first to admit. And it's left us a little anxious. So we're in the middle of a very well-documented anxiety epidemic. I'm not going to bury the lead too much there, but 1 in 2 of us feel like we're anxious, 8 in 10 think the world's going to shit, and 1 in 3 are concerned about their mental health. So that's from our study. It's been echoed in studies like the ABC Australia Talks, thing as well. It's pretty out there. We're all pretty aware of it. For that reason, there's even a new word for it. So grimdark was a gaming term that kind of came to light to describe this dystopian kind of vibe that we've all ended up in. That's taken over our public discourse, and it's sort of coloured our view of the world in the last decade. But all's not lost. A new generation is starting to mean a new outlook. So we've started to notice this air of resilience and even optimism in Gen Z as they take more control, and the balance of power shifts to them, and as they move towards their futures. So while young people still very much acknowledge that the world is a bit cooked right now and there's a lot of work to be done, there's a really interesting shift happening in that 16 to 22-year-old Gen Z bracket when we look over the last few years. So this is through GWI, one of our research tools that we use a lot to help understand our audience. And as Gen Z take on more responsibility for building their future, they're actually starting to feel more positive about it. So things like the environment and the economy, may in broad strokes seem like they're not going well. But thinking about the environment these guys grew up in, where, we weren't talking about the environment 5-10 years ago. We weren't trying to fix it. We weren't, this has sort of taken swell in the last few years. And as a result, young people are starting to think like, okay, it's not perfect and there's a lot of work to be done, but things are kind of starting to head in the right track and get a little bit better. On a personal level as well, things are getting better. So looking at APAC, we know that we're seeing the growth of this massive middle class, which is very centred around young people, and things like buying clothes, buying technology, pursuing hobbies, taking care of their health and wellness, seeing their family and travelling are all becoming a lot more accessible. So there's a bit of some optimism bias going on there. Things are getting better for me, therefore the world is getting better. But it's worth noting that APAC is the most optimistic place on Earth. So as a region and as a place that's going to shape so much of what we see in 2020 and beyond, there really is a new attitude coming through where the economy, the environment and their personal finances are getting better. It's between 1.5 and 2 times the rest of the world. And so it's a different attitude altogether than what we've seen as marketers and creatives and people making content for audiences in the rest of the world. It's a complete outlier to what we see everywhere else. But bigger than this, I think there's something else going on, and there's a word from gaming land that's jumped into the common vernacular as well, that sums it up quite well, called hope punk. So it's this message of keep fighting no matter what. It's this acknowledgement that yes, things are fucked, but if we all band together, if we all try and look for a solution, there is going to be something that we can do about it. Vox wrote about this recently. I include Vox in everything I ever say because they're incredible. I owe half my brain to Vox. They wrote about this in saying hope punk is this new form of weaponized optimism. And they said that genuinely caring about something requires bravery and strength. Hope punk, as a trend, is about standing up and fighting for what you believe in, demanding a better, kinder world, and truly believing that we can get there if we care about each other as hard as we possibly can. So that's a real attitudinal shift that we've seen in Gen Z that hasn't been seen in millennials. Millennials have kind of stagnated in this, oh my God, it's getting bad, what are we going to do, don't know. Gen Z is starting to come through with a new attitude towards this. So some famous hope punks that we've seen in popular culture include June, or Offred, or one of her many noms in The Handmaid's Tale. So one of the most read books and watched TV shows of the last decade, about her basically overcoming this dystopian world that she's in, fighting, and not giving up until she gets where she wants to get. We're seeing it play out in the music space, so super, super optimistic, happy wave of music coming through. Lizzo's just an example of that, just slaying the Billboard charts. You might have seen her volunteering at Food Bank as well, so she's just kind of like hitting all of those, tick, 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 optimism kind of notes. We're seeing it in the amount of superhero films that have come out. So last year, I think there was nearly 20 of them, which is double the year before, and that trend is just continuing. It's these stories of, good triumphing over evil and, things getting better and heroes and all this sort of stuff, and it's becoming this really addictive type of entertainment that we've gravitated towards as well. And of course, Greta. So again, not the first time you would have heard of the bingo card as well. Inspiring a lot of other hope punks like the million or so people that took part in the school strike for climate to really galvanise, mobilise and sort of get out there and actively create a world that they want to live in. And we're seeing the shift towards positivity and hopefulness play out in other areas as well. So, to talk to TikTok, no, I don't have an account. Yes, I do stalk the work account just to see what the kids are up to. We're seeing people move away from this idea of insta perfection, wanting to compare to each other online, knowing that it's bad for your mental health, but being addicted anyway, to more of this kind of like positive vibe, this really creative, dorky, weird, barrierless, platform that is very centered around just like having fun and feeling good. I mean, I'm just going to play you a quick few seconds of what we went out with in our first post that got 500,000 views overnight or something ridiculous like that. It's just, I won't go. It's ridiculous, but that's what I'm doing. It comes out in the content they're reading as well. So last year we were lucky enough to have IBM Watson do a project with us where they analysed 15 years of our web and social data and tell us how what we're writing makes our audience feel. So that's a metric we've never had access to before, and one that's going to become really prevalent in publishing moving forward. So interestingly, the number one thing that pulled people into our site wasn't anger, disgust, fear, sadness. It was joy. It was stuff that made people feel good. It made them feel optimistic. It gave them a view to the future. The topics driving this were things like music and creativity, but also technology and science as well. So that's a cool kind of note to remember in what people are reading. So I guess as we look forward, and I know that I'm going to be running out of time sooner or later, what are the main things bringing this new sense of hope? We know that technology and innovation is right up there. That's from our youth census. It's easy to sort of answer that in a census environment. So apart from that, I like to jump on the Vice Facebook from time to time and just write things and let people answer them. And when we asked what is driving, a sense of hope for people as they look sort of forward into the 2020s, there was the usual hilarious people saying drugs and sex, but good on them. But the number one thing was actually myself. So of the hundreds of responses we got, at least a third of them said, it's me, I'm bringing my own thing into 2020, I'm the one that's driving my own sense of hope. And it's something that we saw in our youth research as well, is that around a third of young people said that the change for the better in society will come from me when they were considering their own futures. So I think that is a really nice note to sort of end on. We're mobilised by optimism. It's a force that's going to really drive that creativity, innovation into the 2020s. It's going to galvanise us and it's going to help us to, take control of how we see our world and our lives panning out and sort of motivate us from there. So I guess to recap on what we just learned, what can we learn from this? Play in the overlaps. So look at those areas where, different mindsets and different, types of influences overlap and connect, and there's often some really, really interesting areas there that you can explore as creatives and as marketers as well. Look towards the human truth in a time of polarity, and digital clutter. It's always the best way to tell a story is letting it come from the person at the centre of that. And if you are in a position to do so, provide a platform for those voices to be heard. And above all, harness hope, you know, like we had a lot of like mental health and anxiety and, you know, worry and stress and regret in the last decade. Let's look forward to this one with a sense of like, okay, there are problems, there are ways to fix them, let's galvanize and try and do that together. I'm pretty sure I'm out of time, but I will finish on this. It may seem like we're at the end of something, but we believe that the world is young, and that's kind of our guiding principle at Vice as well. The next generation at Vice are completely different to the one that came before it, and with that brings a new point of view on the world. So instead of thinking about things as a broken world, try to think about them as a world in flux. And instead of the end of the world as we know it, try and think of it as the birth of something new. And instead of a reaction to an old world, try and think about things as a complex world, but one that's full of opportunity. Because in that sense, it's not the end of things, not the end of the end, but it's the beginning of the beginning.